Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out for the first of our Fireside Chats for KUOW's The Conversation. I appreciate that you're all here this evening. It's going to be very informal. I'll be chatting with Hanson Hosein, and at a certain point, I'll be done with questions, or he'll be sick of me, and it'll be your turn to speak up. So as we're speaking, I'm certain there are going to be some things that you'll have other questions about or that you'll want to add to, because I know there are people here who have some experience in both of the areas that we'll be talking about. So we'll have a microphone to go around at that point. Think of questions or comments that you might have. I just want to introduce a few of the people who work with me on the program who are here. Amy Rainey is sitting in the back. She's one of our producers. And David Hyde and Jason Pagano are over here at the control board. And they're the people that make the radio program work. Now, if you've heard the program before, you might know that I introduced the show and then we play a little music bleeble from The Who. Unfortunately, The Who were not able to come this evening. So what I would like to do instead is if I could get an amen from you as I introduce the show, that will replace The Who. So could I hear you give a giant holler, please? Amen. All right, could I get another one? A little bit more than that, a little more power, please. Amen. All right, I think we are ready to go. Are we rolling? 3, 2, 1. From KUOW 94.9 Seattle, I'm Ross Reynolds at the Fireside Room of the Sorrento Hotel. Amen. Who are all these people? The Sorrento is 100 years old this year, and back in the day, this room was a gathering place for civic discussions about the issues of the day, and we're trying to bring that back with this Seattle salon that we're holding this evening. It's for conversation, but if you must, our Twitter hatch mark is KUOW Convo, C-O-N-V-O. Today we're going to be talking about the revolution in communications that's upending print and broadcasting. And if we were having this conversation 100 years ago, and I said the word broadcasting back in 1909, only the farmers would understand what I was talking about. Because broadcasting in 1909 meant scattering seed. It wasn't until at least 10 years later that it became known as the word that we know it today. Flash forward to 2009, and the internet has become the mother of all communications media. It accompanies the qualities of print and radio and TV. It's the world's greatest copy machine. But its truly revolutionary aspect is how it breaks down the traditional hierarchy between the media outlet and the audience. Along with if you have a computer and an internet connection, you can talk to the entire world, and the entire world can talk to you. So what's it mean for communication and news? This is a topic that fascinates me. I'm in the Masters of Communication program in digital media at the University of Washington to learn more, and leading that program is my guest, Hanson Hosein. Hanson is an Emmy Award-winning TV war correspondent. He's an independent filmmaker. He has 2 law degrees, and he always has the coolest eyeglasses in the room. Hanson, I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about your past history because it kind of parallels a lot of these changes that have taken place, but I wanted to start out with when I first saw your name, Hanson Hosein, I thought, that is so interesting, Norwegian Egyptian, but that's not the case at all. Tell us a little bit about your background.
No, I haven't quite dyed my hair blonde, but my parents are from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and my mother was working at the British Museum in England in the 1960s, and she came across the first name Hanson and said if she ever had a kid or a boy, she'd name him Hanson. So I am blessed with 2 last names. And up till last year, Hosein was kind of a hard name to have in certain countries, especially when I was living in Israel and sometimes here in the United States. But luckily, it's now the middle name of a certain president, so I think I get by a little better now with it.
You've had kind of an amazing career, and you've jumped from many things to other things. You've got 3 law degrees, and even with that background, you moved on to getting involved in media and in journalism. What made you do that, and what was your parents' reaction?
I always wanted to be a rock star. I play guitar, I love playing music, and I realized that my conservative self would never allow me to do something so crazy as pursue music. And so instead I went to law school because I had this 19th century view of law from those great French authors who all were lawyers or doctors who actually practiced literature, and I thought, well, that would be great for me. I could practice something else once I got the requirements out of the way. So I was done by the time I was 23 with law. And for me, journalism was the great middle ground between music and law. I was able to do something serious, but also something very outward and very creative. And so that's why I decided to pursue journalism. And I wanted to see the world. You know, having been born in England with parents from Trinidad and Tobago and lived in different countries, I thought this was the best way for somebody to fund my travel.
How did you get into journalism?
I decided after finishing 3 law degrees that I should do one more. And I thought I'd get a crash course in journalism by choosing the only name brand I knew of at the time, which was the Columbia School of Journalism in New York. And so I was admitted there, and I had the chance to do one more law degree if I wanted to. So I ended up going away from law, and I thought, you know, a year in New York, it couldn't be bad. If I decide I want to go back to law and actually make a living, I can do that. But let's just do that one, you know, thing that would allow me to be creative. And so I got to Columbia, and I loved it. And I ended up doing television instead of print, which was my original idea. And what happened was that NBC, which was 3rd place at the time, came and did a job fair before the end of school, and they were interested in me, and they actually hired me before I actually graduated. So I didn't really have a choice. I went straight in the television news, working with Tom Brokaw, without even thinking about whether I should pursue law or something else. And that's probably what led eventually to my radical career change after.
You became a foreign correspondent?
No, I originally started in investigative news. I was working with Tom Brokaw, who was the anchor of the NBC Nightly News in New York. So I was there for 3.5 years. And then I militated against NBC to try to get overseas eventually. And they said, you know, we realize you have this great international background, you speak a few languages, and you're a British citizen. And I know you want to move to London, but we'll look at your last name. We're going to send you to Israel instead. So they sent the last name guy, Hosein, to the Jewish state of Israel to be based out of there. And at the time, I was a producer. And so I was doing a lot of work with a lot of the correspondents around the world covering wars and disasters. And eventually decided that I needed to tell my own stories, and that's what led to my next transition.
What were some of the memorable stories that you covered when you worked with NBC?
In 1 year, I covered the death of Princess Diana in London. I was actually there at the end where they brought her hearse, and just sort of felt that incredible surge of emotion in England, to the death of King Hussein in Jordan, and then a lot of the wars in the Balkans. I spent a lot of time in Kosovo. Actually, this was the most peaceful time in the history of Israel, which has never happened since or before or after. And I was able to spend a lot of time in Kosovo, even though I was based in Tel Aviv, and did a lot of coverage of the Balkan Wars there. And I thought that was really interesting to see the kind of tribal conflict that was happening there, which is very similar to the kind of tribal conflict we're seeing in Israel and among the Palestinians and the Jewish people in Israel.
You reached kind of the highest levels of broadcast journalism, working with Tom Brokaw, doing what you were doing. What did it look like on the inside compared to the way you thought it would be coming from Columbia Journalism School?
That was the problem. You know, I started right at the top of the mountain, and there was nowhere to go except down after that. So it was heady stuff, because you're working, you know, you got the resources, you got the credibility, but you're not quite telling the stories the way you want to, especially for the evening newscasts. A 2-minute story fills 2 pages on half a side of paper. And so if you compare that to the kind of stories you might read in the New Yorker or the New York Times, you might fill the first 2 pages of the newspaper. And to me, that was not substantive enough. So although it was great, and although our impact and our reach was incredible, especially in Israel, where American foreign policy means so much, and to be working for a premier American broadcaster, that carries a lot of weight. I just felt like it wasn't necessarily in my genuine path. That's not exactly the direction I should be moving in. And especially when I was in the war zones that I was traveling to, I began to see people my age or younger showing up not in these large entourages that I was going in. We were traveling 4 people at a time, $20,000 before we even got on the plane to do a story. And there were these younger people showing up with these small cameras, beginning to shoot their own stories, not held back by the constraints of whatever storytelling you could do at NBC. And in many ways, I've always said that American broadcasters mirror American foreign policy. So you're kind of constrained even editorially about where you're going to go with the story. Well, if you work by yourself with your own digital technology, I think there's a certain amount of freedom that I really envied. And that's what led to my own change. I decided that I was going to get out of television at the height of my career, stock options and Emmy Award notwithstanding. I said, we've got to do something different here and take advantage of this technology.
And you went out and you made an independent documentary with your wife, Heather Hughes, and that's when I first met you. Did you have that story in mind when you left?
Yeah, what happened is I left NBC in 2001. I went off and learned this new technology, and then NBC called me in 2003 and said, can you cover the war in Iraq? Because we're having this embed system with the Pentagon, and We can't put our usual team of 4 people there. They only want 1 or 2 people. So all of a sudden I had the skills to be able to do it. And I did that for a while, but I had in my head this idea about traveling across the United States to do this film about what I thought was a growing insurgency against corporate chains in the United States, against Starbucks and Walmart, which was not a story that people were really talking about at the time. This is before the big buy local movement that happened in the last couple of years. The problem was that we couldn't get any funding, couldn't get any interest from anybody. So we just decided, we got the skills, we got the time, we got the car, we got the dog, we got Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck. Let's just go do it. And so we ended up doing it and using these new social media technologies such as blogging. This was before YouTube. And we made this film. And we were able to sort of reach a grassroots level of audience that actually helped us. They were the ones that contributed to the film. They told us where we should go. So 50% of the film, and I think the best parts, were things that came to us through the blog. And this was still all very nascent back then. But the ability to make a film, with this technology inexpensively and then reach a large audience was quite revolutionary at the time. Now it's old hat. But to me, this was the antithesis to what I was doing at NBC, and it was a very valuable experience.
And yet you didn't have NBC behind you. You didn't have all those network affiliates. You had to kind of build this from the grassroots up. It
was exceptionally hard not to have NBC, because when you call anybody in the world and you say you work for NBC, they hop to attention, either to help you or to run away from you. As an independent filmmaker, you're mom and pop yourself, right? Nobody really pays attention to you. It helped that I used to work for NBC. But we really had to sell ourselves as, legitimate filmmakers and journalists who actually have a story to tell. And in that way, this is very much what we think the future of journalism is, that you have to be very entrepreneurial. You can't rely on brand names or large institutions anymore, or even great resources, and that you have to push yourself out there and build yourself as your own personal brand if you're going to be able to pull this off.
You've been in all these different sectors, and I want to talk to you now about, from all this experience and from what you've done in the master's program at the University of Washington, sort of your idea of where we are today. How dire is the future for newspapers, in your view?
The future for newspapers are on the front lines. They're the canaries in the coal mine. They're the ones who have been hit hardest by what's happened. The future for newspapers is not great, but the future for news, as we've known it, is not great either. Even broadcast. The fact of the matter is that throughout most of the history of media, information has been scarce. And when information is scarce, professionals and organizations can manage that scarcity and make a lot of money off it. And what has happened now in the last 10 or 15 years, especially with the advent of social media and the new technology, information is more abundant than it's ever has been in the history of humanity. And so when information is abundant, anybody can practice the distribution and creation of content around this information, and all of a sudden journalists are competing with people who want to do it for free. And although journalists are professionals and they have the skills, it's hard. That brings the prices down for everybody, and it means less resources and less infrastructure. So newspapers are seeing it first. They're saying we can't afford these staffs, we can't afford all this infrastructure because the revenues aren't there to sustain it, and it's just going to get worse.
Well, we've already seen the loss of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer here in Seattle, and newspapers all around the country are suffering. Pick up any journalism review, and it's a loud lament about laying off staff, about eroding the core reporting functions that are going on at newspapers. Do you think there'll even be newspapers aside from the New York Times and the major ones in 10 years?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, even today, I was just looking at this stuff changes so fast. We even have a hard time having textbooks in our program because of what's happening. But just today, I'm just looking at some of the headlines. Reader's Digest announced that it's going to go into bankruptcy. The Wall Street Journal had an article about how fashion magazines are losing about a third of their heft because there's no advertising and all the advertisers want to go online now. MSNBC is purchasing something called everyblock.com, which is really more neighborhood localization of news. The Huffington Post has announced a social media site. And then we have the Seattle Post-Globe, which was one of the products of the demise of the Seattle PI, saying that it might be in its last week of existence because it can't necessarily make the money through these donations that they hoped was going to be the new model of journalism for them. And so it's a real struggle right now to figure out what that new business model is. It's a little sad to me because I love the ritual of opening a newspaper. I mean, I had my 15-month-old daughter get it from the porch this morning, and I love the fact that I was able to have that. But I know that when she's ready to be able to consume that kind of information, that isn't going to exist. I think news in itself has been a ritual for a certain generation, and we're developing new rituals based on the new platforms. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's definitely going to be change.
It's been said that we don't have a crisis in news. We have a crisis in the business model for news. Do you think that's accurate?
I'm not entirely sure. The business model has been that advertising has fueled a lot of it. I mean, now there's this talk by, say, Stephen Brill of creating this journalism online platform where all of a sudden they want to put a wall around newspapers and say people are willing to pay for news. People have never paid for news. It's the fact of the matter is that news organizations have commanded very high advertising revenues because of this monopoly on information that no longer exists. So where do we go from there? And also, we lament the demise of newspapers, but if they put this wall, this cartel of journalism around these newspapers, there's still going to be stuff available through MSNBC.com, through the broadcasters. So how do you say this part is not free, but this part is? People will just gravitate towards the free stuff. And so the business model for sure is in question. But I think it's also, we never really truly understood how we consumed information and whether we were entirely ready to pay for it to begin with.
Will it all be free? Does information need to be free?
I think a certain amount of information will be free, and I think we may be unfortunately heading to a bifurcation in terms of our ability to access very important, useful information that people are willing to pay for. So for example, I pay for a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, and they have a gate around their online site. But people are willing to pay extra to have access to that because they know that information might actually help them make important decisions about money. But that's not necessarily the case for a lot of people. They're not either able to do that, or it's just a sort of an elite type of source of information. The Economist is another example. Their revenues have gone up, their subscriptions are up because people are willing to pay for that information. But it's a certain type of person who's willing to pay for that. So what does that mean generally for the diffusion of information through our society if it all of a sudden becomes this two-tiered system? And that's kind of scary.
We're really seeing the erosion of the audience and the funding for these general interest newspapers that do a wide variety of things, from ads to sports to hard news to soft news. What about if we go back to the industry that you were such a big part of, television? Where does this leave television as there become so many other ways to watch video besides turning on your TV and tuning into a network or even cable?
That's exactly right. Even today I was experimenting with putting an antenna on my television. We get all the channels right now on cable, and we're just sort of feeling we don't really need that anymore. And I put this on Twitter, and somebody came back to me and said, actually, my younger relative, their television broke, and they just upgraded their laptop instead. I think younger generations aren't looking at television like they aren't looking at newspapers the same way. And so television also has got a problem with revenues because advertisers are saying, I could spend a lot of money and maybe get those eyeballs for now on television, but I can do it much cheaper online, and I might get a different kind of demographic that is more useful to me. And so what we're seeing with television, for example, if you look at NBC, the highest grossing television program with NBC is the Today Show. And that's great because it's in the news division, but I'd say 80% of the Today Show is froth, right? And so you've got the froth subsidizing the really serious stuff, but how much longer can that continue? And will we see a continual degradation in content and quality of content in news on television as they have to respond to what the pressures of advertisers and being able to get those eyeballs, which are continually going somewhere else?
You can see how they're trying to reduce their costs left and right. Leno at 10. A very low-cost show compared to the high-cost dramas that used to occupy a time spot like that on a major network.
I think television's run out of good ideas, especially NBC. They've really gone to this reality programming mode because it's cheap. And I think this is generally what we're going to be seeing, is that more choice means less concentration of power, less concentration of money, which means that you don't have the resources that you had before to do the kind of things like Roots, the great miniseries in the 1970s. I remember old hands at NBC used to tell me that money was so available in the 1970s that whenever a cameraman would travel to cover an international story, they'd fly first class, and then there'd be a first class seat right next to them for their camera. That isn't the case anymore. But it's amazing. That was the luxury of television news. That doesn't exist anymore. The economics of TV and the economics of media generally cannot support that.
Okay, Hanson, now our field. My poem is out. Read our future in radio.
Oh, man. In fact, radio is my favorite medium. I actually think radio's kind of like, I hate to say this, cockroaches are going to be around after human beings are gone. But radio is quite amazing in its resilience. And especially in cities like Seattle and Boston, where they have a huge passion for public radio. I think people, in many ways, public radio represents possibly a future for broadcast and for media generally, if you've got people who are willing to put some money towards it in a kind of a donation system. But it doesn't work for all formats, and it might not work for even all radio stations. I think, as long as we're not able to drive while reading or watching something, radio is going to be around. As long as we commute, I think radio is still going to be available. But I think advertising prices will come down even for that, and we're looking at probably the loss of celebrity DJs and everything else, and more clear channel programming, which is unfortunate.
In this evolution, when we particularly focus on news, what is lost and what is gained?
What is lost is we need to find what people like most about news is that there's a certain trust and credibility associated with certain brand names. If the New York Times says something, or at least up until the Iraq War, if the New York Times said something, you would pretty much say that actually did happen. I know they've gone through kind of rigorous checks and balances to figure this out. I can trust that. Now, with the erosion of these brands or the erosion of these systems, if somebody says on Twitter, a plane just landed on the Hudson River and everybody got out all right, you'd say that's ridiculous. Somebody has made that up. But what it requires is that first of all, you say, I don't trust that. But it might have happened, so let me see if anybody else is saying it. So it requires actually a little bit more effort from the traditional news consumer to actually say, okay, somebody said that, let me make sure it's indeed true, as opposed to having that automatic acceptance of truth. So credibility is at play right now. And that's a little bit dangerous, and it means that we need to educate people to say, don't trust everything you hear on the internet. Of course, we should know that already, but I think it requires that extra bit of media literacy. So that's the pitfalls of it. But I think the great opportunity here, and I think this is a golden age for the distribution of information, is that we have a much greater diversity of sources. I think I'm not particularly concerned or upset that journalism is in its situation right now. I think this is very much something that it created for itself. The internet just precipitated this problem. In the late 80s, we began to see the demise of certain newspapers in certain cities. Readership was going down anyway. Broadcast television's been going down for 15 years, well before the internet. There was a certain wastefulness on the behalf of media because advertising was sustaining something that didn't make sense anymore, and all the internet did was make it worse. And we also saw a concentration of power, especially in broadcast, where a certain small number of corporations controlled information, also in radio. And so what we're seeing now is a breaking apart of that, and I think that's a great thing. I think we need more diversity in voices. And I think we're hearing that using these other platforms. The big question is, can you make a living from it?
Give me some examples of where you see the most exciting new platforms that take advantage of this technology and are doing what you would consider to be valuable, worthwhile news coverage.
Well, I think I love especially the hyperlocal blogging scene here in Seattle. West Seattle Blog and My Ballard are two great examples that are actually setting the stage for the rest of the country in terms of if you can find a niche and you work really hard at it, you might be able to actually make a living and produce really vital information for your constituents. There's also an organization we just have created a relationship with here at the University of Washington called the Common Language Project. These are three really exciting young people who wanted to become journalists, but they knew they couldn't get a job at NBC the way I fell into a job. And they said, you know what, we're going to go figure this out ourselves. So they do fundraising dinners. They apply for grants. They go off to Pakistan for a month at a time to create stories, come back and repackage them and try to sell them as freelance pieces. It's an entrepreneurial approach to journalism that is very, very lean. It's mean, but it's also allowing them to do stories in a much more authentic, vital way than I think that I ever did at NBC. So to me, that's really exciting. So those are the kind of examples that I point to as where journalism is heading, and it ain't necessarily a bad thing.
Do you have any concerns, though, about associating entrepreneurial with news? Because entrepreneurial means looking at a funding mechanism that will work. And in a small organization, once you find those funding sources, you are very beholden to those sources. And as much as one might want to keep them from influencing what you're doing, if you're a small organization and there are a few funding sources, it seems rife for abuse.
You're right. I mean, and I think this is the thing we still have to figure out is the walls between, there used to be a very high wall between the editorial side of a news organization and the business side. So each side didn't influence the other. But now, if you're struggling to make a living and pay your mortgage and you're the West Seattle Blog, how do you figure this out? And so it's really important that we we come up with new ways to understand this. And I think to a certain extent, it's actually being figured out for us. For example, if you're looking at, say, a technology blog like Engadget, which is one of my favorite blogs, they might publish a really glowing review of an Apple product. And then you'll start reading the comments, and half the comments will say, hey, did you get a paid product placement from Apple from this? So there's actually a certain level of self-policing that goes on in some of these places. And I think to a certain extent, it's okay if there's a bit of money changing hands as long as you're pretty transparent about it. So these are parts of the new business models that entrepreneurialism doesn't allow you to reach that same high tower that journalism once had, that you actually have to be quite commercial as well if you're going to make a living. Or we're actually going back to this whole patron system that Mozart had in the 18th century, where the Archduke of Vienna says, I'm going to pay for you to create this content. This is maybe we're looking at more of this grant system or some kind of donation system that allows people to produce content, and we're moving away from this very commercial industrialized system that we had the good fortune of having in the 20th century that was largely subsidized through advertising revenues.
Jeff Jarvis is a blogger and a media consultant, a professor, and he's got a new business model for the hyperlocal news you were just talking about. He's thinking of almost replicating what we saw in mainstream media there. The idea, organize local bloggers and citizens into metro-wide networks in the 25 top markets, and then sell local ads across their sites. They'd remain independent, but they would be an advertising base covering a vast swath. What do you think of that idea?
I think it sounds great in theory. The big question is there enough advertising? Are there enough advertising dollars out there to go around to sustain these people? I mean, when you have something like Google AdWords, like if you can buy a word for $1 on Google all of a sudden, then get your word out through that. This is not the $1 million Super Bowl ad anymore. And so, are the economics there for that kind of advertising to sustain that many people? I'm not entirely sure. I'd love to see that happen. But that's the problem. We were continuing to think in this 20th century mentality that advertising is what sustains media. Even when media first started out, after the farmers got over their broadcasting term, it wasn't entirely certain that advertising was going to be what sustained even television programs. Up to then, it was kind of seen as a loss leader for companies like Westinghouse to advertise, to say, we've got this new radio system. Well, we need to provide content so people buy the radio, and that's the way it's gone. That's the way it started, and then they started realizing that people actually wanted to pay to get word out on these systems. Now there's a possibility that you buy, like Nokia in Europe, they'll sell you a cell phone, and you get a bunch of music for free on it for a year. So it's the content all of a sudden becomes very tied to the device itself, and you lose that advertising connection to it.
I want to get back to that Nokia in a moment, but the third season of Mad Men just started this past weekend, a look at both the culture and the advertising business of the early 1960s, which has pretty much gone away. At that time, of course, you could reach a huge percentage of the American public by simply putting an ad on one of the three networks. That is gone. What happens to advertising, which has supported a lot of this media in the face of this atomization of media, where everybody's listening to so many different things, it's hard to aggregate a large audience, which advertisers want?
No, I know that. We talk, especially here in Seattle, about journalism being in crisis, but actually all of the traditional communication industries are in crisis. Advertising, marketing, public relations, and journalism. And all this technology and these distribution platforms change the game for everyone, especially advertising. We're seeing even a lot of user-generated content campaigns for advertising. Why would you hire an advertising agency for $500,000 to launch a product when you can just do a contest online through Facebook or through your Twitter account to get them to create a video for you? So what does that mean for the highly paid professional advertising business? And the answer is they don't know either. And so in the university, we have contact with a lot of other programs around the country, and they have these mass communication departments. And to me, that is so 20th century. Mass communication just sounds like a big machine churning out stuff. And that doesn't exist, or we're moving very quickly away from that. So you even get the word mass out of communication if you're going to truly understand where this is heading. And the fact of the matter is it's heading to a much more engaged individual who can pick and choose, and be involved in the production consumption cycle of information, and that just changes everything, and especially the economics of that.
Okay, let's turn away from mass communication and news to the way we communicate with one another. How people access the internet is really changing rapidly. As I understand it, more people access the internet through phones than through computers if you look around the world. What's it going to mean as we move deeper and deeper into this realm of the very personal communication, handheld way of connecting to the internet and using all of those resources?
No, there's huge consequences. I mean, in fact, some people like to say that for most of the world, their first access to the internet, because we're so used to having access to laptops and desktops here in North America, but for most people in the world, their first access to the internet is through a cell phone because of the data connections and everything else. And so if you actually are live and wired or unwired at all times with your cell phone everywhere you are, that has consequences both in terms of how businesses can reach you, how you can reach businesses, privacy matters. The fact that you can communicate to the entire world at any time through that device, it changes the equation in terms of how communication works. And so to me, it's very exciting, but it's also a little scary because you can be walking down a sidewalk and somebody sees you wearing some really cool glasses from Eyes on Fremont, which is where I got my glasses. and all of a sudden they take a picture of it and they post it to their Twitter account, and then there's maybe some Autobot out there that says, Eyes on Fremont, let me do a little ad for that. And then it enters into this new crazy ecosystem of communication where a lot of things start happening automatically. And all of a sudden, this guy who thought he was just minding his own business has become a walking ad for a certain glasses company from Seattle. So it's really exciting, but it really, I don't think we're even quite ready to face the realities that we are going to be experiencing in the next 2 to 3 years.
Well, companies that might be feeling a little bit too close in on our privacy, but also other people. I mean, with GPS and the ability to find out where people are instantaneously, we've seen a big problem with kids not quite understanding the significance of putting something on a Facebook page or a MySpace page, which could be there years and years down the line. Do you think at some point we're going to see people pulling back from this communications technology because there'll be more and more problems with the revealing of their privacy and some of those problems?
That's the inherent tension with all of this right now, is that we are getting incredible convenience by having the power of a mainframe computer in our pocket to be able to do so many things, but it also, we're giving up a lot at the same time. I have Google Latitude on this, Google Maps Latitude, so I can let anybody know who I allow following me to know where I am at any point. I don't have it on that much because that concerns me. On the other hand, I'm looking at my little daughter who I just worried about her all the time. If somebody came up with a product that says you can put an RFID chip in your daughter's body so you know where she is at all times, that's crazy. That's very George Orwell, 1984. But the convenience and the security factor come into mind there, and I started to say, well, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. I might actually be interested in pursuing something like that. So that is the cost-benefit analysis that we go through now with technology. Convenience versus privacy and versus the kind of individual lifestyle that we have. In fact, I go back and forth sometimes. I've got a notebook now with a fountain pen. I get tired of using digital media. I made this crack a few weeks ago that I'm so enamored with using a pen and paper that I might start a master of communication in analog media, and I made that crack on Twitter, and I got a lot of positive response. I think people are actually quite exhausted by the constant changing face of digital media and always being connected. I think it is tiring, and some people may opt away from it if they are given the choice.
Do you see examples of a generation gap between the way that younger so-called digital natives are adopting this and older people who are immigrants who are coming to this later on? There's been a lot written about just the different standards of protocol. With certain groups of people, if you're sitting there looking at your email, it's considered to be very rude. With other groups, probably younger, it's not so much of a deal. Do you notice that?
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the classroom, I think it's actually you need to accept the fact that people are going to be in a constant state of distraction, especially younger generations, that they're used to being connected through different media at all times. And so it's going to be a different set of expectations. And so we actually, when we're looking at our program, we actually try to admit a good cross-section of demographics, because that somebody in their 30s who's really into Twitter isn't good. That's not the same situation with somebody in the teens or in their 20s who are really into Facebook or a more multimedia social experience. Twitter is not a very social experience. It's actually another form of broadcasting in a weird kind of way, while Facebook allows you to share a lot more. But what also is at the bottom of all this, or fundamentally, is that I think younger people are actually looking for a more collaborative experience in anything they do. And this whole top-down approach that we've had for the last 100 years to the way we communicate, even in the classroom, is changing. And so students want to not feel like they're being dictated to by some expert, but they want to feel like they're in some collaborative exchange of information, that they have something to contribute. Recently, I just purchased some furniture for our new, we're creating this thing called the Media Space at the University of Washington that allows for this collaborative thinking. And so Steelcase, which is this furniture manufacturer, has just come out with this new product called Mediascape. And they've done a ton load of research saying that even in the office, we're moving towards this more collaborative brainstorming approach and away from this hierarchy within the institution. And you have to promote that. So instead of having a huge conference table in the middle of the room, you've got almost like a bar with seats around it, and people can commune and look at a screen, and they hit this little Jeopardy-like button when they want their laptop to go live on the TV screen. So that's the kind of cultural change we're seeing within organizations, largely because of the availability of this technology.
The technology research firm Gartner just put out a report, and they said that they think social software and the microblogging sites like Twitter have tipped over the peak, and they're soon going to experience some disillusionment, at least among corporate users. What do you think about that?
No, I really think I think that's the cool thing to say, especially for early adopters. Oh my God, Twitter has jumped the shark because all these people want to be on it. The platforms themselves may come and go. We've seen that with MySpace, for example, that it's kind of hit its peak as well. But the fact of the matter is, just like the same arguments were made in the early 90s with the web, and now online shopping is just a fact of life. The genie's out of the bottle on this. The ubiquitousness of the internet and this ability to collaborate through the internet without having this institutional intermediary of governments or large business means that people can do some really powerful, effective things without that. And so that's going to continue. As long as the internet is there, people are going to have this ability to collaborate on different platforms, whether it's Twitter or something else for years down the line. And that just changes the equation for everything. And so you can belittle Twitter or Facebook or whatever, but you can also look at things that are happening in Iran and say, this is a conservative country where you have a dictatorship that has tried to control the traditional media of communication, and they're still able to get out using the internet to get things out. And that's a game changer, and it doesn't matter what you call it, and it's not going away.
I want to talk about personal communication and also link it to politics next. Much was made about Barack Obama's ability in the last election to utilize social media tools. He is back in campaign mode this week, campaigning on what we're going to do with healthcare and healthcare insurance in this country, and he's trying to rouse the same kind of campaign support on behalf of what he'd like to do with insurance reform. There are some signs that the grassroots is not quite as fired up. What do you think that says, or maybe does not say, about politicians using social media tools to rev people up and get their support?
I still remember having this conversation during the election campaign in class, and you actually came up with one of the most sort of salient points during that conversation, was Barack Obama's success due to social media, or was it because Barack Obama, the charismatic leader, that incredible brand name, was able to use just another platform to get his word out? And I think it might have been a unique sort of circumstances that allowed that social media campaign during that period of time to be really very effective. On the other hand, I think he had a lot of goodwill from the grassroots after the campaign leading up to his presidential election, and there was a bit of disillusionment with how the White House since then has become a little bit more traditional in the way that it has communicated, and also a little bit more not deceptive, but they're actually co-opting a little bit of this to get their way. And there's a feeling that there's less openness in the way he's using it. So it's quite possible that Barack Obama has lost a bit of his authenticity, which is really important when using social media, to be able to use it in a way that's as effective as he had during the election campaign. And I'll say one more thing about social media and Barack Obama. It was great that he was able to use these new technologies to do it, but it wasn't social media that won the election for him. It's a great start. Social media gets people into the tent, allows people to organize, but then you actually have to do something to carry through on it. You have to do something physical. You have to do something face-to-face. You actually have to go out and vote. And so it's really important to understand that social media is not going to be it's not going to change everything in terms of, but you've still got to do the heavy, feet on the ground kind of work. And that's what he had. He was really well organized as well.
I want to go to some of your comments or questions to what we've raised, but kind of a final couple of questions for you, Hanson, before we do that. I'd like to have you kind of imagine we're back here in 10 years. It's 2019. Give us maybe not one, maybe a couple of different views of where we might be when it comes to news and communication between one another. Maybe one positive one and one negative one.
Okay, the positive one is that we are absolutely surrounded by ubiquitous media and ubiquitous information feeds coming through our cell phones. There might be, maybe this fireplace will still be here, maybe it'll be a virtual fireplace, but we'll probably see screens around her possibly with information, with things happening all the time that allows us to be plugged in because we want to be plugged in all the time. And an incredible diversity of sources, and we're telling different stories, and we're hearing from different people. And the report from Iraq is not from some guy who looks like me from NBC, but it's from an Iraqi, and it's somebody that we trust because they've been doing something from their house and getting it piped in live to here, and that's really great. That's the diversity that I'm hoping for. That's the use of technology that makes great sense. The alternative situation might be that, once again, these technologies and these methods get co-opted by institutions that aren't willing to let go of their dominance, like a Disney or an NBC. And all of a sudden, the authenticity is gone, and the power brokers are still playing the same game. And we don't know who to trust anymore because you got the guys at the top who are, co-opting the message with whatever their message is. Then you've got, the bloggers at the bottom who are just saying whatever, and they don't have that sense of trust of it related to them. So we don't know we don't know whether that level at the bottom is indeed communicating something that's useful to us. We can't measure the relevance and credibility. And so, we could be getting, hate messages from an organization being mixed in with something else. So this is the incredible tension right now. It's an incredible opportunity for anybody to communicate, anybody to tell their story. But we don't know whether we have the filters in place as individuals to be able to be able to use it usefully. And so, to me, fundamentally, what we need to be doing as educators at University of Washington, any university and any organization, is to create this literacy, this media literacy, so people understand how to use it, how to be part of this ecosystem, how to be producing it. There are some people here in the crowd from Journalism That Matters, which is a really great organization that is indeed focused on the audience is no longer the audience. These are the people formerly known as the audience, as Jay Rosen from NYU would say, and that we need to be focused entirely on helping younger generations be involved in the consumption and production of media, hopefully in a civically responsible, useful way that allows us to all understand really relevant information and to make decisions based on that information, and not having the usual players involved in this at all times.
Well, what do you have to add, or what questions do you have from what we've been discussing so far? David has a microphone over here because we are going to be recording this for our program for tomorrow. Is there anything you'd like to ask about any of the specifics we brought up about the future of news, or those of you who are involved in coming up with the future of news might have some thoughts on where it might be going beyond what we've said? Just raise your hand and David can come over and give you the microphone to ask a question or to comment.
Hi, I am wondering how much we have been here before. I am wondering if you might have some thoughts on comparing colonial broadsheets, for instance, to bloggers. Okay, more people have computers than printing presses, but how different a place are we really?
It's a good question because, we saw this wild and woolly environment even during the Revolution, the American Revolution, where people, the bloggers are the people who are posting things up on lampposts and whatever else. The difference is, I think, is that back then we were still looking at not necessarily a top-down way to communicate, but it was, communication was coming from one person and large amounts of people were consuming it. I think what happens now is that the large amounts of people who are consuming it can also be involved in the production and also can organize themselves based on that. And I think it creates a much more collaborative affair. I think Clay Shirky is a professor from NYU who we love in our program. And in his book, Here Comes Everybody, he says these technologies allow individuals and small groups to act with the informality of a birthday party and with the scope of a multinational corporation. It changes the power equation in a really grand way. And I think that's what is so different now with this technology through primarily collaboration and self-organization. Obviously, that kind of broadsheet, it did help foment a revolution. But back then, most people this was an agrarian society, and people didn't really have time to actually be involved in the production of information. We now have a great deal of excess capacity as individuals in our very high-tech society, and everybody has the time or the capacity to be involved if they choose to pursue these passions, and that's what makes all the difference.
And please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Peggy Holman, part of having created something called Journalism That Matters, that's been hosting conversations amongst what we now think of as the evolving ecosystem of journalism, made of mainstream media people, media reformers, people formerly known as the audience. And I just wanted to add some of the observations that to build on some of what Hanson was saying. And I want to pick up on this thread of authenticity that you mentioned multiple times and just point out three ideas. One, to this question of entrepreneurial journalism, there's an interesting counterpoint, I think, that goes along with that, because what we're observing, and frankly I think it's partially because we haven't solved the business model, is that as much as journalism is becoming entrepreneurial, it is also very much about the public good. And in that sense, I think returning to former roots, perhaps even more strongly than it could, as it has gotten caught up in more corporate kinds of forms. The second item is, with this idea of journalism as a conversation, as kind of the operating metaphor that's emerging rather than a lecture, I think there are some interesting roles emerging. One is journalism is becoming more about hosting a conversation. So nice for what you're doing here, Ross, but it's being the conveners of people who become sources of tips as well as authenticators of stories and correctors, the kind of self-correction mechanisms, as well as helping, and I think another role is that of navigation as we move from information scarcity to information abundance. So that's another journalistic role emerging. And the third is the nature of story itself. I think journalism has tended to take a twist in this country to focus on what's collapsing. And we're in a very interesting time where indeed not only journalism, but we are seeing collapse in a number of the systems that we have relied on for a very long time. And the interesting thing is there's also a renaissance going on in each of these areas. And so the nature of telling stories about, given all this, what's possible now, what's emerging, what are the things that have been experimented on in a small scale that are coming to the fore. Those kinds of stories, I think, begin to have legs that engage and inspire in a way that the kind of storytelling that we've been predominantly seeing simply doesn't anymore. So those are some thoughts I'd add.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, additions, subtractions?
I'm Mike Levin. I'm a student at Seattle Central Community College in filmmaking. And I've been reading recently, in particular Filmmaker magazine this month, was talking about digital distribution of film as a way to get past the cinemas and the hold on distribution. Do you have any thoughts about that, both in documentary and fictional film?
Yeah, it's a good question, because this also speaks to the changing face of economics. When Heather and I did our first film, Independent America, we use these new social media tools to find an audience. We were also able to get broadcasters on board eventually once they realized what we were doing. So we broadcast around the world and got some pretty good licenses through that. On our second film, which we finished last year, which was about New Orleans and how small business was so key to the recovery there, we'd taken a very different approach. We got a Canadian broadcaster on board that paid for some of it to get done, but it's been much harder to getting other broadcasters involved because they have less money because of advertising revenues are down. But we've also gotten offers from streaming media companies to put our content up for free, and we might eventually get paid for it. And we were also using a local company here in Seattle that said we'd love to sell the DVD. So we went straight to DVD on the second film, like we did with the first film. But with the second film, it's there's new platforms available where you can sell the movie yourself, and you don't even have to carry an inventory. We made an inventory of these first films, and the second one is somebody orders the film from this company. The film gets made as the order is created, and the DVD gets made. And so it allows a lot more flexibility for filmmakers to actually get their product out. What's missing is that you're not going to make a lot of money off that unless you get a real big hit on your hands. So you can't rely as much on a broadcaster to come to you with $50,000 or $100,000 in a license fee to really make this worth your while. And so when people come to me and say they want to become filmmakers, I say, well, it better be your passion, first of all, and we'll see later if you can make any money off it, especially because everybody can be a filmmaker now. So we're competing with a lot more people out there, a lot more outlets, and a lot less money that is much more diffused. And so it's much harder to actually make a living off it unless you're really, really good or really creative in funding.
Any other questions or comments?
I'd like to know if we are, or where we are going to go for solid information that's been a part of the world as we know it. I wouldn't know much about anything just wandering around by myself. I'm very concerned about the loss of respected researchers, journalists, organizations to tell us about what's really going on.
It's a serious concern because we can say that we'll rely on television to tell us the stories, but I find especially network television used to be very superficial. And I know for a fact that when I worked at NBC, we all read the New York Times and the Washington Post before we figured out what we were going to do that day, because they were the ones who did the serious reporting. They had the resources to do the serious reporting. So there is a deficit there. There's no doubt about it. And I think the way we have to look at it now is that journalists used to be sort of these guardians that we appointed to actually do the work and the legwork for us to figure out what was important so as we could make these decisions. With the abundance of information, what we need to do now is to figure out how to organize this information or make it available in a much more organized way so we as individuals and citizens can actually be involved, not necessarily as citizen journalists, but also as watchdogs ourselves. I think, for example, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they put out a ton load of information. We're almost, is an avalanche of information about how companies do business, so much so that it's impossible for us to figure it out. Well, what if we compelled companies to organize that information and tag it in a way that made more sense to more people? And that way, if you really were concerned about a particular company, you could go to a certain source that's hosted by the government and figure it out very quickly, and then spread that along through Twitter and through blogs and whatever else. And so what you're doing is you're organizing the information in a way that it's just not newspapers that are giving you that credibility and that trustworthiness, but we as citizens can be involved in that exchange of information and that organization of information. But right now, you're absolutely right. We're in a period where there's a great confusion about where this is going to happen and where we're going to get this. And there's probably this incredible information gap that will allow politicians and major companies to get away with murder for a while until we figure it out.
And the fact of the matter is, I think it is going to require more of the news consumer than it may have in the past. There are just going to be more sources out there. And I just found my own news consumption has changed a lot. I'll be looking at different sources 6 months from now than I did 6 months in the past. But through the course of looking, you'll find more useful and reliable sources. If you're online at all, my one recommendation that I have for everybody is one great place to start, and it's with Old Line Media, but it's a great briefing on what's going on in the nation and the world every day. It's called Today's Papers. It's on Slate, and someone gets up really early in the morning and reads the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal for kind of what the mainstream media is looking at and summarizes it for you. And it kind of gives you a baseline for where mainstream media is going. And then from there, you can jump off into other versions and other ways of looking at the news. But it sort of gives you some grounding, because with all this proliferation of sources, I have the same feeling sometimes. It's where do I start to find out what's going on? And it's the same kind of thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier, Peggy, about there is so much out there that it's hard sometimes to figure out where you're going to put your shovel in the ground.
And in a strange kind of way, I actually find myself being more informed by using Twitter now than I would have by relying on one source every morning as a newspaper, because there's I've chosen very carefully who I'm going to follow in Twitter. And so if I look at my feed at any time, it's an eclectic mix of people who I have decided to ascribe a certain amount of trust and relevance to, who are sharing links and ideas. And if you look at that, there's a wonderfully eclectic array of those links and ideas that come out. And if something big happens around the world, if something really cataclysmic happens, I know that at least 10 of the people I'm following on Twitter are going to start talking about it. I know that I'm interested in the future of digital media, so some of the people will be sharing links of something that's happened at Google that it's going to be relevant to me. So I think, to me, that's exciting, that I'm getting a greater diversity of sources from people that I have decided to trust that wouldn't necessarily just come from that one information source that we usually have used.
Twitter is so divisive. I'd like to do a quick poll here. I want to ask who uses Twitter and finds it useful, who doesn't use Twitter and can't figure out what it's for, and who's undecided. Can we start with those who use Twitter and find it useful?
These are all my students.
Okay, how about people who don't use Twitter and can't imagine why they would ever want to use it? All right, and who's sort of in the middle, not quite decided yet? Okay.
It's an amazing generational thing too, Ross. I recently spoke to a bunch of new undergrads coming in the University of Washington, about 250 students, and I asked them, who's on Facebook? And I'd say almost 100% were on Facebook. Who's on Twitter? There were about 10. And so it's interesting to see that split. And the way my reasoning behind it is that Facebook is a very social thing. Twitter is not very social. Twitter actually takes an effort, because it's not what you're doing. People always think that's what I had for breakfast. No, Twitter is actually what you're thinking. And that takes a lot more effort to figure out, when it's opposed to Facebook, where you're just sharing your photographs of your family or what you drank that night.
Other questions, comments?
I got a quick one.
Yes.
And this actually may be another fireside chat entirely, but it has to do with journalism education, and with the proliferation of all this information and the premium that's placed on quality information. What happens with the level of selectivity in journalism programs at universities, undergrad and at the graduate level? And I suspect that would reflect the values of the university and the program specifically. What happens to the selectivity level?
It's amazing, because you would think that in this day and age that journalism programs would be suffering enormously, but I've heard that especially at places like Columbia and Northwestern, they've had more applications than ever before. And young people come to me and they say, "Should I go into journalism?" I say, "Absolutely, don't do it. I mean, at least don't pay for an education to do it. Go, if you're going to really do it the way these people who I've mentioned do it. Like the Common Language Project. Be entrepreneurial. If you got a story to tell, go figure out how to tell it. Start practicing it now." But the fact of the matter is that people still want to get an education in journalism. So I think what has to happen, and it is happening in certain schools, especially ours, is that you have to change the nature of the curriculum itself. And so forget it, there are fundamentals in journalism we still need to respect, like reading and writing and editorial selection. But it also means that there actually has to be a course in entrepreneurial journalism. You actually have to teach the students how to be freelancers, because when they graduate, they're not going to get a job at Tom Brokaw at NBC the way I did. And they have to think about how they're going to be involved with this. So when I'm looking, if I was on a journalism selection committee right now and I knew that we were a professional school wanting to train new journalists, I'd be looking at people who have an incredible amount of courage and passion. It's not because they want to be Katie Couric, and that's what people used to see journalism as an entree into celebrity type status. You got to really care about this stuff if you want to do it, because it's not a clear path to making a living. And so you want people who want to be innovative and use these new tools and take some risks and figure it out. And this is what we do in our program as well. We want a very collaborative approach to understanding what the solutions are, because there are some really deep problems right now.
Hanson, what you say reminds me of what Buckminster Fuller used to say about the future of education, that everybody's going to be going out and making documentaries, that is, as you tell the stories, you learn not only about what you're telling about, but you learn how to tell the story better. And I do think that we're going to become, as a result of these media, a nation of better storytellers. And Ross's show kind of is a model in how that links with mainstream media. I actually also wanted to mention that I think local, hyperlocal, not only websites, but also weekly newspapers are continuing to be where advertisers are going, because people are reading those and they're getting to them. The whole conversation has reminded me of one of my mentors, Robert Theobald, who was a futurist, who said, "When information doubles, knowledge halves and wisdom quarters." And I think what people are going to be looking for is the wisdom. And so where are the trusted sources? Where are the synthesizers who are making sense of all the stuff that's going on in this new media environment? And I'm curious what you both think about the idea of the fourth estate. I mean, if the press, in fact, is an important part of our system of democracy, should the government be supporting it? How should it be supported in the future? And also to put in a quick plug for a Journalism That Matters that we plan to have in January at the University of Washington. You'll hear more about it later.
Well, you've made an incredible number of really interesting, provocative points. Firstly, it seems to me that news has become a commodity. Everybody's producing it. It's being cut up to pieces and put on websites and aggregated. So you're right. In many ways, if you really want to be a journalist and a well-known journalist and a really useful journalist, maybe it's less in the production of the news and the content and more in the synthesis and the analysis of it. We need more of that. We need more wisdom. There's no doubt about it. Should the government be involved? I am a free-thinking, small government kind of guy. I would hate to see the government involved. This country does not have a history of having the government involved in the production and regulation of information. I would not like to see that happen. However, I do understand where people see some interest in having that. And I used to work with the CBC in Canada, where the government was heavily involved. And I'm British, so I see the government involved in the BBC. And they create some incredible sources of information. I don't think that would go over with about 50% of the population here. I don't know. What do you think, Ross?
Well, I don't know if it would go over with 50% of the population, and I don't know if it would go over well with journalists. Public radio would not exist if it were not for government intervention, setting aside channels for FM non-commercial broadcasters. KUOW would not exist if it wasn't for the good graces of the University of Washington in establishing this radio station and getting it on its way. Our radio station and public radio in general is now largely self-supporting, and government support makes up only a tiny, small part of it. So it might sound funny coming from me in that we have benefited so much from it, but every time the government gets involved, you're involved in a political process. And as we've seen over the last 8 or 12 years, the political process swings from left to right pretty radically, sometimes every 4 years. And as soon as there's government money involved, politicians will be involved in deciding how that money is spent and giving it out for those who they agree with and trying to take it away from those who they disagree with. The history of public broadcasting is full of incidents of this taking place, going back to the establishment of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and some of what the Nixon administration tried to do. So I think the government funding just comes with too many strings to sort of say, yes, it should absolutely happen. I mean, maybe there are ways that government can set up formulas for some equivalent of the FM set aside or some equivalent for public service broadcasting, for public access broadcasting that came through when cable came on the scene. But you have to look very carefully to what you wish for when it comes to government funding of news media in particular. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sarah Studeville. I'm from the Common Language Project, and I think this is probably one of the most interesting conversations happening right now about the new landscape of especially funding for journalism. And I think this issue of whether or not the government should be involved in funding, where does the funding come from, I think we have to start by talking about how there are different types of news out there. And there's sort of the social service storytelling type of journalism, and then there's a kind of journalism that can actually do kind of well on a free market and where business models are a possibility. And in the past, with newspapers and other outlets, there was always this kind of subsidy built in for that social service storytelling. And there was the stuff that always made money and attracted advertisers. And then there was room for enterprise and so on and so forth and investigative work. And I feel like with these types of storytelling and journalism parting ways, the question becomes, where does the subsidy for that social service storytelling come from? And I feel like throwing out the government as a possible source of money, I think would be a mistake. And in part because I feel like when you look at any of the potential sources for that kind of storytelling, it's all going to come with strings. And as someone that has received grants from numerous places to do that kind of storytelling, they all come with strings. And it just sort of gets back to what kind of firewalls do you put in place? What sort of editorial boards do you have? How do you work to make sure that you maintain your integrity as a journalist and a storyteller? But I don't see how investigative work, social service news, that kind of journalism that I think we all really want to protect is going to happen if we aren't willing to take a few risks and accept a few strings. So I just wanted to throw that out.
that dog wants to make a comment over there. I sounded pretty upset about.
You know, that argument, I think that's a good argument, and I think it would work in any country. This political culture of this country is quite happy to allow businesses or philanthropists to be involved in the production of information and to a certain extent to co-opt the editorial content of the information. But there's something about the government being involved that I think would create another revolution if that happened in this country, for better or for worse. But, you know, what's wrong with a tax break to a newspaper like the Seattle Times? If you do that, the firestorm that will happen, it's amazing. I think it's just the way the political culture of this country has always been. There's a deep distrust of government, and I don't think that's going away, even despite the current economic crisis.
Yes, over here.
Hello, my name is Pam Kilborn-Miller, and I'm a social media project manager on the Vancouver Peace Summit that's coming up. And I have a question about Fox Cable News and its current healthcare content. My question is, how will we find common ground and solve big problems when there's so much anger and misinformation on a broad level? Through the example of Fox is one example.
That's a really good question, and I know that people will point. And you have to figure this out. You know, is it social media? Is the fact that the online environment is so freewheeling that allows for this misinformation to happen? It's quite possible this 15 years ago this happened during the last healthcare debate. You know, it can be the right-wing talk show hosts, and Fox News is helping to propagate some of this as well. It's just the nature of the way information is used and consumed and produced here in the United States. And the only saving grace this time around is that there are other outlets for people to try to be as loud in opposition to it, and that, you know, people can say something, but you don't get away with it as easily as you did 15 years ago because it was coming through a broadcast outlet and there was no way to engage in the information. And so, yeah, Fox News may be spreading this through their commentators, but there's equal pushback elsewhere. The question is anybody listening? Or are they all going to play the information game the way we follow our sports teams, and you say, you're wearing that shirt, that we're going to stick to that idea, and you can't convince me otherwise. And that may indeed be the situation in this very polarized country. So it's a little disheartening what's going on with the healthcare debate, but I also see pushback happening because we have new options to be able to get that information out.
Hey, Matt Stringer, I'm one of Hanson's students. I had a question about the AP. And recently they've been going after bloggers, trying to charge $2.50 a word. And what do you think of some of the defensiveness that a lot of these institutions that are sort of, they're kind of being knocked down by some of the new media? What do you think of that defensiveness?
I don't think it's going to work. I think this is what I call the news cartel. This is what people are trying to put walls around information that they originally made very freely available because they thought that it was a way to build their brand, and now all of a sudden they want to put the walls up because nobody wants to pay for it. Nobody ever wanted to pay for it. And so now, you're going to change the rules of the game. And so the Associated Press has got a real public relations problem. And I think it's not going to serve them well. I don't think this journalism online system is necessarily going to work either. Because, the minute you try to force people to pay for something, they're going to go say, where else can I get it for free? And even if they don't recognize the quality as being not quite as good as what is behind the wall, unless they're really, really concerned about the quality of the information, you're going to go somewhere else. So that's the nature of having this internet freely available on every possible device. And we have to be quite aware of that. And institutions that think they can regain control over something that they once controlled are really, it's a fool's game.
But Hanson, I have to say I sympathize with AP. I mean, if I were to pick up that DVD of Independent America and take it out and do a cheap knockoff and put it in a store somewhere and you came in and saw it, I think you'd be rightfully shocked and outraged that your intellectual property had been duplicated and was being sold by someone else for their profit as opposed to yours. Yeah,
and that's true. I mean, but you also have to recognize there's only so much you can control. I mean, we've just made this first film freely available for streaming online because we realize, people can still buy the DVD, but I think there's also some value in making it freely available, both for furthering the conversation and just because that's building my brand. So you have to let go a little bit. And the AP has just made some really silly comments about this. I don't think they've quite understood how the ground has shifted under their feet in terms of how they've tried to control this information. I do understand that they want to retain some of their intellectual property, but I think they've lost credibility because they made some missteps early in this game.
I don't see any other comments, but I just have 3 quick kind of bonus lightning round questions for Hanson to leave us with some kind of practical, useful information. Hanson is a total gadget head, so I wanted to ask you, what's the gadget you're telling everybody about? Second of all, what's the piece of software or internet website that you're telling everybody about? And third, let's go old school. What's the book you would recommend people take a look at if they'd like to learn more about these issues?
Oh, dear. I'll start with the books. That's the one that's off the top of my head, really easy. It's The Wealth of Networks. If there's no textbook necessarily in our program, but this one from Yale University Law School, Yochai Benkler, it's actually made available for free on his website through a Creative Commons license, is really about why this is happening, what's happening, and where he thinks it's heading, and why it has to happen. And to me, it's really an excellent, excellent book, and I strongly recommend it. He needs a serious editor, though, so read the first 4 chapters and see if you can survive the rest of it. Favorite technology, that's a tough one. I mean, I'm really into smartphones, and but I think I'd like to... I'm a big fan of the... I'm a big fan of the netbook right now. I think, although it's a really anemic, underpowered thing, the fact of the matter is, Apple will continue to sell its high-end, high-profit things to people who are creators, who think they're cool and creative, and I love Apple products too. But the revolution here is in the low end of consumer end products, and the fact that people can take a $300 laptop with a $150 flip camera and broadcast to the world is really quite amazing. And so I'm really focused in the developing world on the tools they're using there to communicate, and I'm really focused on what average people or average incomes here in the United States can use to really make a change happen. And so I think things when we're looking at inexpensive tools like netbooks and like flash video cameras and even smartphones that don't have really expensive data plans, I think that's where it's all happening. I'm very excited about that. And your question was websites.
A website or software?
I can't think of one right now.
Okay, you can boot it.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I never get to say this on the radio show. Please remember to tip your waitress. And thank you so much for coming. And thanks to Xiaoqing and Barbara and Jeff here at the Sorrento for being our gracious hosts for this evening. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks. The dog was at the crowd.